Good evening and a very warm welcome to Galloway Hoard. Where did the silver come from? It's wonderful to share this event with you. My name is Sally Magnuson and I'm a writer and broadcaster here in Scotland. I also have the privilege, I think it was a privilege, of being brought up with the Vikings. My father, Magnus Magnusson, was an Icelander himself and translated several of the medieval Icelandic sagas from Old Norse into English. And he also wrote a great deal about the Viking Age. And he made sure I was thoroughly indoctrinated into a view of the Vikings as traders, master metal workers, and intrepid explorers, rather than merely the bloodthirsty assassins of popular repute. Although my dad, I remember, did concede that our own ancestors had given a boost to that lurid reputation in the sagas themselves. So the exciting work being done to rediscover Viking Age Scotland, and especially all that we're now learning through the truly fantastic Galloway Hoard, is just meat and drink to me. I can't wait to talk to our two guests about the wonderful collection of silver in the hoard and the archaeological detective work that's piecing together where it's come from and what it means. Now, a little bit of context before we meet our distinguished guests. The Galloway Hoard, be in no doubt, is one of the UK's most important archaeological finds of the 21st century. Buried around the year 900 AD in Dumfries and Galloway, the hoard lay undisturbed for over 1,000 years before being unearthed by a metal detectorist in September 2014. A successful fundraising campaign supported by the National Heritage Memorial Fund and Art Fund saved it for the nation. And in 2017, the hoard was allocated to National Museums Scotland. And, it really was an incredible discovery, this hoard. There are more than 100 objects in it, and they include the largest and most varied collection of Viking Age gold objects known from Britain and Ireland, along with an unparalleled range of rare materials. Incredibly, wool, linen, silk, leather, wood, even animal gut have survived, providing an extremely rare opportunity to research and reveal new aspects of the Viking Age. However, the bulk of the hoard is made up of silver, over 5 kilograms of silver bullion comprising arm rings and ingots. And this silver is our focus tonight. Where did it come from? What can it tell us? And how did it come to be buried in southwest Scotland? Joining us to address these questions and many more, I'm delighted to welcome Adrian Maldonado and Jane Kershaw. Hello to you both. Can I ask you, first of all, Adrian and Jane, to briefly introduce yourselves?
I can start. Hi, my name is Adrian Maldonado. I'm an archaeologist here at National Museum Scotland. I joined the museum in 2018 to work on the spectacular Viking collections that resulted in a book called Crucible of Nations. And I'm very lucky to call myself the Galloway Hoard researcher now as part of the Unwrapping the Galloway Hoard project. So that's a partnership between the NMS and the University of Glasgow, and it's part of a £1 million research project supported by the Arts and Humanities Research Council.
Jane, how about you?
Hi, my name's Jane Kershaw. I'm an Associate Professor of Archaeology at the University of Oxford, where I specialise in Viking Age archaeology. I'm very interested in Viking Age material culture. I've done some previous research on female jewellery from Scandinavia that's found in England. And I'm now PI, so Principal Investigator of a 5-year grant all about Viking Age silver, analysing it to try to establish its provenance.
And how did you first become involved with the Galloway Hoard project, Jane?
It was amazing timing, really. I have this ERC project, so it's large scale. It had money for 5 years, looking at silver from all over the Scandinavian homelands, but also trying to capture the full areas that the Vikings settled, including the Irish Sea region, Britain, Scotland in particular. So when this opportunity came up to study the hoard and we realised we could analyze it in its entirety, it was a fantastic opportunity. And there was also lab space available for us in Edinburgh, where a lot of this work could be done. So that was fantastic. It just came along at exactly the right time.
So it's a lovely collaboration between archaeology and cutting edge science.
Yes, we are establishing a geochemical profile using isotope science and looking at trace elements, all of which requires minimally invasive sampling techniques. It's something that really has only been possible in the last sort of 10, 15 years or so.
Well, thanks very much for that, Jane. We're going to hear a lot more from Adrian in just a moment, because we're going to get a little bit of a film about his work, which will tell us about the extent and the variety of the silver within the hoard. Let's hear this short film from Adrian.
The Galloway Hoard is a glimpse into an age of silver. Things changed fast in the Viking Age. War and political change were in the air, but no matter what side you were on, silver was always the same value. Many Christian kingdoms put their silver into coins. Others displayed their silver, wearing it as jewelry and giving it as gifts rather than as payments. Regardless of how you handled your silver, it was clearly the currency of the day. But silver was not plentiful. There were only a few sources that were worked at this time in the early medieval period, and they were tightly controlled by the ruling classes. The Vikings sought to disrupt these supply chains and break in to that silver economy. Silver was the currency of power, and the Vikings wanted in. At just over 5 kilograms, the Galloway Hoard is one of the largest silver hoards found in Britain dating to the Viking Age. About 70% of the objects in the Galloway Hoard, and most of that weight, is made up of objects that are silver. At the core of the Galloway Hoard was a silver lidded vessel that was full to the top with a mixture of different objects, some of them silver, many of them gold. This group of silver here consists of objects that were found inside the silver lidded vessel, and they're completely different from everything else in the hoard. Some of them look as if they were almost related to one another, but they all show signs of care, wear, and repair, which means that they were not all new when they were included in this hoard. These were heirlooms. You can see, for instance, this rock crystal sphere that is encased in silver. We can't date that very carefully, but what we can do is look at how the silver tells us that it was used. The rock crystal sphere has been encased in this silver frame, and that silver frame has been damaged. It's missing one of its arms, and it would have had a pendant fitting so that it could be suspended, and that's gone. It looks like it was buried in this condition, which means it was probably quite old by the time it made it into the lidded vessel. The silver objects outside of the lidded vessel are very different to the silver objects found inside that lidded vessel. This group of arm rings was placed up against the lidded vessel, and you can see that these armbands are still shaped in the way that they would have been worn around the wrist or around the arm. These are quite rare in Britain and Ireland. They are ribbon-shaped broadband arm rings. The ornament on these is very elaborate and shows a high level of craftsmanship. What's interesting about these 4 is that all 4 of the rings look superficially quite similar, but one of them stands out as almost twice the weight of the others. This is a double armband, and so whoever that belonged to was probably of a higher status than the others. All of them are richly ornamented, and they're all tied together by this 5th armband. What was the point of tying these things together? Do these 4 armbands represent 4 different people? And if so, does the binding of the 4 represent 4 people coming together in a kind of contract, or the fulfillment of an oath, perhaps? Outside of the lidded vessel, there was a very large deposit of silver bars and arm rings. This is the heaviest part of the hoard by weight. It contains the most amount of silver. The kinds of objects that we have here are basically two different types. If some of your silver is coming in the form of coins, but also bits of jewelry and other bits and pieces of objects that have been hacked up, then maybe the easiest thing to do is to melt them down into these bars. Then you have, at a glance, some sense of how much silver you have available. And one thing that makes the Galloway Hoard silver stand out is that the ingots are almost completely unmodified, almost as if they are fresh from the mold. So they are producing lots of these bars of silver at a time. And then there's the arm rings. Most of this group falls under that very distinct type that we get in Britain and Ireland that we call the Hiberno-Norse broadband arm ring. They're quite repetitive, even though every single one of them is unique and handmade. These types of stamped and decorated arm rings are of a type that is fairly well known in Britain and Ireland, and we can date fairly closely from the last quarter of the 9th century to the first quarter of the 10th century. So they belong to a specific period of time, but it's very rare to find as many of these arm rings in a complete form. Generally, when we find silver armbands and ingots in Viking Age hoards, they are hacked up. That gives them their name, hack silver or bullion hoards. This is an economy where what was important and what was valued was the weight of pure silver. The idea of casting silver into armbands that can be worn as jewelry is an idea that seems to come from the Scandinavian world in the Viking Age, and it is imported here to Britain and Ireland. It seems that the majority of the arm rings in the Galloway Hoard were hammered out into the arm ring shape and then decorated with stamps and punches the way that we see on arm rings of this type. They were never carried into that last step of making them into an arm ring. Some of them are laid out flat. Some of them have a distinctive type of fold where it's only the two ends of the arm ring that have been pinched back. Some of them have only one end folded back. And some of them look like they've been folded in half or into a third. And these represent 4 discrete groups within this parcel of silver. That's interesting because it reminds us of the 4 arm rings that are bound together in the arm ring cluster. There's one really important detail that gives us a little bit more information about who was behind the deposition of this hoard. 4 of the armbands from the lower parcel were singled out for one further modification. They were marked with a runic inscription. We know that the Vikings used runes. They use a very specific runic alphabet. The runic alphabet used in these inscriptions in the Galloway Hoard was a different alphabet. It was the runic alphabet used in the Anglo-Saxon world. These arm rings were inscribed with Anglo-Saxon runes, and they have elements of words that we can recognize as Old English words. Some of them seem to be abbreviations of personal names, names that we know were in use in Northumbria at this time. Now, what's interesting about that is that we associate hoards of hack silver like this with the Viking Age and with Vikings. But in this case, at least some of the people involved in bringing this hoard together were Old English speakers who were literate and were able to write in the Anglo-Saxon runic alphabet. It's interesting that there are 4 different runic inscribed arm rings in the lower parcel. That reminds us of the 4 fold types that are found in that lower parcel and the 4 arm rings that are bound together in the arm ring cluster outside of the lidded vessel. There's a pattern emerging in which there look to be 4 different donors, perhaps, 4 different individuals or groups involved in bringing this parcel of silver together. Finally, we have the upper parcel. Potentially, this was deposited above the rest of the hoard to act as a kind of decoy. When you first look at it, the upper deposit looks very similar to that lower deposit of hack silver. When you look at the ingots, or those bars of silver,
They're very different now from the bars of silver found in the lower parcel. The arm rings are superficially, again, of a very similar type as those found in the lower parcel. These are the same kind of Hiberno-Norse broadband arm ring that you find in the lower parcel. But the difference is that the ones in the upper deposit are almost all hacked or clipped or modified in some way. What this tells me is that the upper parcel of arm rings derives from the same stock of silver as the rest of the hoard, but has maybe passed through one or more transactions or one or more hands since the lower parcel was put into the ground. Once the hoard was recorded, excavated, and lifted, they found more bits of silver. The one distinctive object that was found outside of the hoard is this little bit of armband. A runic inscription has been added to this ring in particular. The word that's inscribed on this arm ring with those runes is one that we can recognize as an Old English name. It says Egbrecht, and that is a very common Anglo-Saxon name, Egbert. When the Galloway Hoard first came out of the ground, it was reported as a Viking hoard. The more we look at the silver in particular, the more things get a little bit complicated. It looks like what we have here is many different groups of silver brought together by maybe different groups of people. The big question is whether all of these silver objects are coming from similar sources or whether they are being sourced from different parts of the Viking Age world. Can we get any closer to finding out who these people were and why they brought this group of material together?
Gosh, that was such a fascinating glimpse behind the scenes there, Adrian. I love the amount of detection that goes on, starting, the way you start to see patterns, trying to deduce what they add up to, these literate Old English speakers writing bits of names there. I mean, it must be extraordinarily exciting.
Absolutely, but you can also kind of get lost in all of the different variables, so which ones are clipped and hacked and which ones are complete, and do they fit into this pattern or that group? And you can kind of get lost trying to sort of figure these things out. But yeah, great fun.
And as you were saying, can we get closer to establishing where all this silver came from? And that, Jane, is where we come to you. Silver, one of the most tangible remnants from the Viking expansion, obviously a vital source of information that's very well researched. I'm just wondering how your project differs from what's been done before.
Yes, silver has been a focus of academic research for the last sort of 20, 25 years or so. But what we wanted to do was address it with new scientific techniques to actually work out where it comes from. When you have an ingot or an arm ring, that's not how the silver arrived in Scandinavia. That is silver that the Vikings have melted down and cast into those specific artifact forms. And when that happens, you lose all trace of the original form that the silver took. So you can't tell what the source of the silver is. Viking Age silver has never been analysed using lead isotopes before on any scale. So this was a first opportunity to use the technique to really work out where the silver is coming from.
Well, let's take a closer look now at what the silver analysis involved and what it can tell us. We're going to play a presentation from Jane. Let's hear Jane's presentation now.
We were really excited to analyse the silver in the Galloway Hoard, and we were expecting that it would fit into the pattern that we've seen elsewhere, including in hoards from England, which is that the majority of the items would be made from Islamic silver, probably from melted down dirhams. But actually, that's not the case with this hoard. When we're analysing objects like ingots and rings, we can use a couple of different actual methods of getting lead isotope data. This is the isotopes of lead that is found within the silver. And although these items look like silver, they contain 1 or 2% lead, and that's really a vital source of information. But we're also looking for trace element levels, and there are two that are particularly important for us. These are gold and bismuth. These are important because they withstand the melting down and the recasting, the recycling process. So it ought to be the case that they relate to the original source of the silver. And it's by using these two pieces of information in combination that we can really get the closest answers to where the silver is coming from. So it's really critical for the interpretation of the Galloway Hoard that Western European and Eastern Islamic silver have distinct and unrelated geochemical signatures. So if we look at their lead isotopes, so these are the isotopes of lead that is naturally contained in the silver, we see that they're different. The Eastern silver seen here in blue have higher isotope ratios than the Western silver seen here in orange. And that's really helpful for us because it means when we get the results from the Galloway Hoard, we can plot it and we can see where it best aligns from this background data. It's not only in the lead isotope data that the two background sources are different. It's also true that they have different levels of gold and bismuth. These elements are really important for us because they remain consistent throughout the recycling and recasting process. So the levels of gold and bismuth shouldn't change, and therefore they relate to the original ore. So we see, for instance, that Islamic coinage is much lower in gold. It hovers around 0.2 or 0.3 to 4%, whereas Western coinage is often a lot higher. In this period, it's generally between 0.6 up to around 1%. Bismuth levels are also different. They're very low in Western European silver, but higher in Islamic silver, and very high as you go into the 10th century, which are these values up here. So if we have both the lead isotopes and the trace elements together, then we can really get quite a sophisticated signature of how the silver should look, and we can compare it to potential sources. So we took the items from the Galloway Hoard to the Grant Lab at the University of Edinburgh. It was great to be able to do this within the city. So here we're bagging up some of the arm rings and the ingots, and we're trying to fit them into a very small tray, roughly 10 centimetres by 10 centimetres. They're going to go into this tray, into this laser ablation machine, and a laser beam is going to fire at them and ablate a very small amount of material, which is suctioned out and then fed into a mass spec for the generation of trace elements and also lead isotope results. And this is a really great technique because the laser beam is about the diameter of a strand of human hair. So it leaves no trace that you can see with the naked eye. So it's great for the objects because it's minimally destructive. So you pack the objects into this tray, put them in the laser ablation machine, and we await the results. So just as a reminder, this is the background potential sources of silver. This is the background spread of lead isotopes. We have the Eastern Islamic silver in green, and here I've actually separated the Western silver into two groups, the Carolingian silver in orange and the Anglo-Saxon and the Anglo-Viking coins. That's coinage that we might expect to be circulating in England and the Danelaw in purple. So we have three potential candidate sources here. So we got the results from the Galloway Hoard, and they were very surprising, actually, because only one item, this annular arm ring with the lovely knot to close it, just this one item plotted with Islamic silver. That's the yellow triangle seen in the middle of this line of green circles. When we've analysed Viking silver, we find that the majority of the silver is made from melted down dirhams. So the fact that only one item plots with Islamic silver is very unusual. Instead, what we find is that most of the objects in the Galloway Hoard correspond to the isotopes of Anglo-Saxon and Anglo-Viking coins. So you see, those are the coins seen in purple here. And the Galloway Hoard objects are the yellow triangles. So you can see that they really cluster in this central area. Whereas if we looked at Carolingian silver, so silver from Francia, from the continent at this time, it would be slightly offset. It's more slightly above where we get this major plot in this area here. And so I think that Carolingian silver is not a prominent source of silver going into the Galloway Hoard objects. Instead, it seems to be silver that is available in England at the time. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's Anglo-Saxon and Anglo-Viking coins that are being melted down, but rather the Galloway objects and those coins share the same silver source. So most of the items in the Galloway Hoard plot with Anglo-Saxon and Anglo-Viking coins, but a group down here in the lowermost section of the chart don't overlap with that source of silver at all. And in fact, they relate to something very different. They relate not to silver, but to lead. When you have a silver object, sometimes that silver has been refined prior to being cast, meaning that it has had its impurities removed to raise the level of silver fineness. And when that happens, lead is added to the silver, it's heated, it draws out the base elements like copper and tin, it forms a litharge, and then that is removed, leaving behind pure silver. And when that happens, the lead isotopes that you get will relate to the lead that has been added to the silver rather than the lead that is naturally contained within the silver. And this is the case here. These items don't plot with any silver source that we know, but they do plot with lead. And they specifically plot with lead that was circulating in Dublin at this time. That's a very good indication that these silver items have been refined. They've been refined with lead that was available in Dublin. So Dublin is probably the location that they've been refined and therefore cast in, meaning that we can tell from the silver analysis that these objects, which include ingots, as well as Hiberno-Scandinavian broadband arm rings, were in fact manufactured in Dublin. And if we look at the distribution of this arm ring type, we see that it's concentrated around the Irish Sea, although no finds actually from Dublin itself, rather surprisingly. But it's clear that the items do circulate around the Irish Sea area, and the Galloway Hoard is one of the hoards with the highest concentration of finds in it. And we can now tell, because of the metal analysis, that Dublin was the likely place of manufacture. Well, one very surprising aspect of the Galloway Hoard concerns the gold. Normally in Viking silver, we see gold between sort of 0.2 and 1%. 0.2, that we get very low gold in Islamic silver, whereas in Western silver, it's around sort of 0.6 to 1%. But the gold in the Galloway Hoard that you can see here is much, much higher, up to 12% in the case of one ingot. And that actually is not intentional. Gold is about 10 to 12 times as valuable as silver in this period. So you wouldn't want to include it in a silver item. You'd much rather separate the gold and silver and gather together the much more valuable gold. So I think what's happened here is that gold has been present either in gilding or as a gold inlay or an applique of some sort. And rather than being separated from the silver item, it's been thrown into the melting pot, as part of a silver object, and the whole lot has been melted down together. That to me suggests a very rushed, somewhat haphazard process. And it may be that we're looking at a metal casting process that has been done whilst people are sort of in a hurry. Maybe they're trying to move on to the next location. It does rather point to the rather haphazard processing of loot. We do know that the Galloway Hoard contains Anglo-Saxon gilded items, like the pectoral cross we see here, as well as these incredible hinges with true Hiddle style decoration. It also contains Anglo-Saxon gold objects like this gold pin. Any one of these items, if sort of melted down in their entirety, could generate high gold levels like we see in the Galloway Hoard. So it's a good indication that they're melting down Anglo-Saxon silver, but Anglo-Saxon silver that sometimes contains gold. So it's certainly elite material. I think the analysis gives some hints about how and where this hoard was assembled. They're melting down this loot in a fairly rushed and haphazard manner, but they're doing it to create their own artifact types. These ingots and rings are what the Vikings want to have. They don't want to carry around coin. They're more interested in items that can be worn and displayed and that can be used within a bullion economy. We normally see a lot of Islamic silver in Viking hoards, which suggests that the Vikings are bringing in silver. Only one item, this annular arm ring here, appears to have been made of Islamic silver. So this annular arm ring, not only is the silver different, the stock of the silver that it comes from is distinctive, but actually the form is very unusual as well for this hoard. Most of the artifacts in the hoard are either these flat, broad band arm rings with this stamped decoration, or they're ingots. This is the majority of the hoard by weight. This artifact, however, it's a Scandinavian type of manufacture. It's a closed arm ring with a knot at the terminal. It's very typical of items that we'd see in hoards within the Scandinavian homeland. So already it kind of stood out as an artifact that was different from everything else. So this item could have been cast in Scandinavia and then brought over and before it was deposited in the Galloway Hoard. But in fact, the rest of the items don't seem to have Islamic origins. Instead, they're made of silver that was available locally, stocks of silver from Britain, probably originating in Anglo-Saxon coinage or Anglo-Viking coinage, so the coins that the Vikings themselves struck when they started to rule in England. There are a few other surprises in the Galloway Hoard as well. One of these is that some of the items contain very high levels of gold, far higher than any other silver we've analysed within this project. This ingot here, for instance, contains around 12% gold, which is a really high level. And that tells us something about the origin of this silver. People wouldn't have intentionally created an alloy like this with 12% gold and the rest, more or less the rest, silver. It appears to be the result of the accidental inclusion of gold, which suggests that the ingot was cast maybe in a rush. It was cast somewhat haphazardly, involving small amounts of gold, perhaps from gilding or gold inlays in an otherwise silver artifact, which points in the direction of high-status silver metalwork containing gold elements that the Vikings or whoever is making these artifacts is melting down in a rush and is not taking care to separate those elements out in casting a silver ingot. This hoard was mostly sourced locally. They're getting access to silver in Britain through their various raiding and looting activities. In a way, it seems to confirm the sort of worst stereotypes we have of the Vikings, that they are going out, they are looting. It is a violent campaign of raiding, and they are after silver. The Galloway Hoard has been extremely important for the overall project. We've been looking a lot at the sort of central Scandinavian regions, Denmark, southern Sweden, but the Galloway Hoard has given us a perspective on what's happening in the Viking economy at the sort of western edge of what archaeologists like to call the world of the Viking Age. What's happening in the Irish Sea region, which is quite far removed from these Eastern Islamic trade networks. It's showing that actually Islamic silver doesn't penetrate in large numbers all the way to the west. There are other local sources of silver that are available. And the Vikings are quite pragmatic people. They seem to be exploiting what they have available locally, and not bringing silver with them, but taking what is available. It's also really important because it's telling us something about the processes behind the making of these silver objects, the acquisition of these objects that other hoards simply don't tell us. We can see that some items are being cast in Dublin. We can see that some items are being made of silver that's been melted down in a rush and leaving behind the high gold that wasn't necessarily desirable. So we can see the sort of movements of these people that buried the Galloway Hoard. A lot of the silver in the Galloway Hoard matches silver from Anglo-Saxon England. And we know that the Galloway Hoard was buried on what was potentially a monastic site. It's certainly possible that it was the silver in the stores of this monastic site that was melted down and made into some of the arm rings and ingots. That's definitely one option for some of the silver. So because we have a context for the hoard, and because we can use the meta-analysis to tease these different stories, we can see some of the processes behind the acquiring and the making of the silver. The Galloway Hoard has changed my understanding of silver in the Viking Age because the results are anomalous. I think without it, I would have assumed that Islamic silver is 99% of the silver that we see in the Viking Age. And that's clearly not the case. There are limits to the spread of this silver. It's not actually traveling west as far as we might think. And it suggests that there are regional economies in the Viking world, and that when it comes to the Irish Sea region, Anglo-Saxon silver is far more dominant, far more widespread than I actually might have guessed. It's probably Anglo-Saxon silver that's going over to Dublin, being refined and being cast into rings and ingots. Well, we didn't know Anglo-Saxon silver was making that trip before this analysis. So that's quite interesting in itself. So I think it's pointing to much more regional stocks of silver, that it isn't a one-size-fits-all solution, and that the Eastern links, they're certainly profitable, but they don't explain everything. You know, wealth is available locally, and where it is available, the Vikings will seek it out. Of course, there are still more questions we'd like to address when it comes to the silver in the Galloway Hoard. And one really standout item is the lidded vessel. It looks at first glance very similar to a vessel in another Viking hoard from the Vale of York. That's a Carolingian vessel. But some people have pointed out that the iconography on the Galloway vessel is actually much more similar to Sasanian iconography. So that's something that I think that lead isotope analysis, trace element analysis could really contribute to. Is it in fact Sasanian silver, or is it something that's much better paralleled within Europe? So that's something that I hope we get the opportunity to look at.
Fascinating stuff in there, Jane. Thank you very much for that. It's amazing, just amazing to be able to draw on the scientific data to get this fuller and really quite unexpected understanding of the provenance of the silver. We've been having lots of questions in, and I will turn to these soon, because actually the provenance of the silver has occupied a number of you. But just before I do, Adrian, just, coming to you after we've heard all this from Jane, how have these results changed your understanding of who's behind this hoard?
The results of this study are phenomenal. I mean, this is exactly the kind of technique that you wish you had, 5-10 years ago, that you could actually almost start fingerprinting the sources of this silver. So, I can't tell you how excited I am to see the results of the wider project beyond the Galloway Hoard, but it's been absolutely amazing. The thing that really I stress to everybody is how little information we have about what's going on in this corner of Scotland where this hoard was deposited around the year 900. Galloway is one of these places that has famous monasteries going into the 9th century, famous power centers. You know, this is part of the Kingdom of Northumbria. But by the year 900, the records have slowly started to blink out, and we lose a lot of that information. We don't know the names of people, and we don't know where the power centers really are by this point into the Viking Age. But it shows us, this hoard, just how much power and wealth is in this area. And I thought, you know, because of the Anglo-Saxon runic inscriptions, that this is sort of silver that is potentially being made locally, and sort of the Anglo-Saxon sources of that silver might maybe lend itself to that. But then you look at these arm rings that are decorated in this very classic, you know, Hiberno-Norse style, and it's hard to imagine some local Northumbrian person speaking English, but wearing one of these really sort of Viking looking armbands, you know? And so now I'm more leaning towards maybe this is something that has been looted back from Vikings, or maybe a gift or a payment of tribute from Vikings to local Northumbrian rulers. But, you know, these things are kind of all changing now. And so I'm really keen to hear what questions the audience have.
Okay, well, let me take some of the questions from the audience. A lot of interest in the silver and its provenance. Barry, for instance, saying, do we know where the Western, in quotation, silver was mined? And a similar question from Dolores, what do we know about silver mines operating more locally in Europe and specifically England in this time period? And I'll maybe just include one from Tess as well, and come to you, Jane, on all this. Is there any way of telling if the silver has originated from objects dating from much earlier times, for instance, Roman silver?
Those are fantastic questions. Yeah, so on the mining question, we do know a little bit about mining in Western Europe at this time. There is a prominent mine in Western France called Mel in Aquitaine. And we know that that is being mined. It's a lead silver mine, and it's also a mint. So Mel silver is a really important source of Carolingian silver coinage in this period. It's not the only source, but it is a really important one. And it's really well characterized in terms of its geochemistry, and we can see it makes no real contribution to the Galloway hoard. It's possible that one or two Carolingian coins ended up but wouldn't impact on the overall results. But clearly we do not see that silver, which is interesting in itself. England does also have its own silver-bearing lead mines, which could potentially be a source of silver. However, the yield is very low in these mines. Probably the Romans didn't mine these lead mines for silver because there just wasn't enough silver contained in the lead to make it worthwhile. The Romans didn't do it. Probably the Anglo-Saxons aren't doing it either. And so I think that English mines could produce lead that could be used in refining processes, but I don't think that the silver is rich enough in order to be mined. So there's a good question, where does Anglo-Saxon silver that might go into coinage or true Hiddle style silver ornaments come from? And there's a chance that could be older silver, or silver that's been in circulation for a few centuries. But our analysis suggests that it comes over from the continent at some point, but is refined with English lead. It therefore has a distinctive lead isotope signature, and it's probably in circulation over decades. And so we are able to distinguish it elementally as well as isotopically from, if you like, pure Carolingian silver.
Okay, well, fascinating stuff. Here's, let me see, Peter asking, did the Vikings test the purity of silver? And if so, how did they? Do you know that, Adrian?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of ways in which they can do it. So one of the things that I'm working on with the Galloway Hoard silver at the moment is looking down the microscope for exactly this kind of evidence. One of the most common ways in which silver was tested is by just taking a little tiny slice with a knife on the edge of a silver object. It's very common to find on the ingots and arm rings of the types found in the Galloway Hoard. So the study of this nicking process is something that's pretty well advanced. And I found some evidence of that from the Galloway Hoard. But what's really interesting is that the ingots, the bars of silver that are in the hoard, are not only complete, as if they've been recently cast before they were deposited here, but only one of those silver ingots has any test marks on them. So these things are pretty fresh. The armbands are a little bit more, they have more evidence of being tested, but only very few of them. So a lot of the silver that's ended up in this hoard is relatively pristine. So they've made it pretty recently before it was deposited here. It hasn't really circulated very much. So if this is the product of Viking loot, it's from a pretty recent acquisition of that loot. It hasn't really got those signs of lots of really intensive testing. It hasn't passed through too many hands before it comes to Galloway.
So interesting. Peter is asking, I suppose this is a question for you, Adrian, what distinguishes Hiberno-Norse arm rings from other styles of arm rings?
Well, by this point, by the year 900, let's say, around the time of this hoard, there's not a lot of evidence for the production of, if you like, local or Anglo-Saxon or Trewhiddle style armbands. You have other kinds of dress accessories with the Trewhiddle style ornament on them, some of which are found in this hoard. You have brooches, and you do have this very unique, so far unique to the Galloway Hoard, hinged objects. We have a matching pair of hinged objects that seem just about the right size to kind of go around your wrists. You know, so it could be that that's a very special type of armband, but by and large, there's not really a very prominent kind of Anglo-Saxon, if you like, a local kind of armband by this time. This Hiberno-Norse style is defined by the style of decoration more than anything else. It's that stamped ornaments where you've got the sort of repetitive stamp used to make designs like crosses and lines and geometric patterns. That's something that seems to be coming from Scandinavia, but the kinds of armbands are circulating specifically in the Irish Sea Zone and Ireland and sort of North and Western Britain. That's why it's called the Hiberno-Scandinavian or the Hiberno-Norse style of ornament. It's something that seems to be specific to that Irish Sea Zone for about a 50-year period. So we can kind of date it within a really tight window.
Another question about the Anglo-Saxon runes, which also fascinated me. Would they still be in common use at this time? Someone is asking. If not, would there only be certain professions or classes that would use them?
Oh, that's such a good question. And whoever's asked that question, they're on the right track. We've got a forthcoming report from our runologist, a colleague of ours at the University of Wales called Dr. David Parsons. He's the one that has sort of read the runes for us so far. And he's done the work on runes across Britain, Ireland, and Wales. And he has noted that the southwest of Scotland, what's now Galloway and Dumfriesshire, is a real cluster of runic use at this time. In fact, it's one of the parts of Britain where they are using runic inscriptions longer than almost anywhere else. So that means that there is something distinctive about rune use in southwest Scotland, which just reminds us that this part of what's now Scotland found was indeed part of the English-speaking world. It doesn't become part of England later on, but at this time is still seen externally as part of the English-speaking world. And these runic inscriptions are part of the evidence that shows that whoever is executing these runes is probably someone relatively local to Northumbria.
So interesting. Jane, why was silver so highly desired by the Scandinavians that they were prepared to, risk their lives acquiring it, and went to all sorts of, violent trouble to do so often, as you pointed out? What is, was it predominantly money, or was it ornament, or was it status, or what?
Yes, they use silver in various different ways, and part of the appeal is its versatility. So in the Galloway Hoard, many of them have been made into arm rings. They're not quite they haven't completely been finished because they're still flat. But the idea was that these could have been worn. And that's a clear display of wealth. So you're literally wearing your silver. They love to have big silver brooches, arm rings, neck rings. So there's definitely a bling element, and that's a clear display of status. But with silver, it's also a medium of exchange, and you could use it you could cut a bit off, put it on a scale, demonstrate its fineness by nicking it, as Adrian was saying, and then you could use that silver as a form of money, like we would today, and it would pass in a metal weight system, where what mattered was the weight and fineness of the silver. And so we find, for instance, scales, handheld balances. We find little weights that would have been used to weigh out the silver as well. So you could have used it in a trading situation. But also, if you didn't want lots of little pieces of hack silver, well, you could gather those all up together, melt them down again, and cast an ingot that's perhaps easier to store. So the Vikings like silver because it's a very flexible means, a medium. It doesn't lose its value over time. It's reliable in that sense. It's not like a harvest, which might fail in bad weather. It's not like livestock that might get ill and die. You can rely on it. And if you need to divide it up when you're passing it on as part of your inheritance, it's also easily divisible. So I think silver is seen as a durable, long-term, a good long-term form of wealth. The big problem is, of course, that you can't eat it. You can't use it when you really needed something. When your harvest did fail, you needed to feed your family, you needed to produce clothes. Well, silver isn't going to do that. And in times of hardship, in times of famine, no one's going to really take your silver and give you their last bit of food. And this is still a society where most people are farmers. So there is all that element of yes, but it's still, you still need your farmland and your livestock and your crops, which keep you alive. And silver, of course, doesn't do that.
Well, we are drawing into the last 5 minutes here, but there's a question coming from Kate, Jane. When looking at composition of silver alloys, do you find there were compositions they tended to favor? Did they like a pure silver when making items for a particular purpose?
Yeah, that's a good question. And they do tend to be fairly consistent. It's not a very strict rule, but I do think that they cluster between about 92 to 96% silver fineness. That's ingots and rings. Sometimes we find on bits of delicate ornament, like filigree, so twisted wire, those have a higher silver fineness, and that's probably so that they can be twisted and worked more easily. So I think the Vikings would have deliberately added elements like copper to harden the silver, to make it, when they're sort of hammering it out, they definitely are very much aware of the different properties of metals and how to manipulate the alloy to suit a certain end. So yes, very fine sort of filigree granules that we see on disc brooches, for instance, tend to be higher silver content than items like ingots and arm rings. but everything has a good high standard, better, the same or better as sterling silver today.
Adrian, can I ask you how important is the Galloway Hoard outside Scotland? Where does it stand internationally?
What a great question. I mean, what Jane's project in particular is showing is just how connected this corner of what's now Scotland, this corner of Galloway, really is to the wider world. There's surprisingly little sort of Scandinavian silver, but there's a lot of Scandinavian style input if you're talking about the style of objects. The silver might not have traveled very far, but may be connected directly to what's going on in Dublin. And there's all these different links. And if we delve even further into the stuff that we haven't even got to talking about, like the material in the silver-leaded vessel, then we're really getting some exotic materials, things like silk and rock crystal, which have traveled thousands of miles to get here. It just really puts into perspective how much of a dark age this is not. You know, Galloway is connected to the wider world in really surprising ways. And it's work like the scientific analysis that Jane and her team are doing that is really bringing this to light.
You want to give us a quick thought about that wonderful lidded vessel, which Adrian mentioned there is right. We are running out of time. There's so much to talk about, but that is a fantastic thing.
It's an incredible vessel. It looks very much like the one from the Vale of York Hoard. So I think if we can, analyze that, get a sample of material, it's going to be more of a challenge because we can't use laser. It's much too big an object. So we're going to have to take a really small sample from the vessel itself. But I think that has huge potential to sort of enter this debate and say, okay, well, can we see a Western European origin, or is it something that has come from further afield that's potentially Sasanian or Sogdian or something much more exotic? I do think that lead isotope results will really contribute to that picture.
Yeah, because I was going to say to you as a final thought from you that new technology is developing all the time. What do you think the future might hold for the hoard in terms of research and analysis?
Oh, yeah, well, thinking not so much about the silver, but the other sorts of artifacts that Adrian was mentioning, I think there's enormous amounts that could be done with the textiles that is being done. There are textile specialists working on the hoard. I, like most people, favor, my favorite object are the dirt balls in the hoards with gold and bone inclusions. I think, geological analysis of that earth material could be really fantastic for demonstrating where this earth is likely to have been connected. So those are other areas where I think scientific approaches could really blow our minds.
And a final thought from you, Adrian, about the future and what it might hold for our understanding of the hoard, which has it's given us so much, but it holds so many mysteries still.
Yeah, well, I work as part of this brilliant team of really sort of genius level people. And the best part about it is that you're one of the first people to hear about the discoveries as they come in all the time. And the lead of this project, the Unwrapping the Galloway Hoard project, Martin Goldberg, he likes to say that hoards and treasures like these, the news and the media, they like to focus on the day of discovery and how exciting it was. But as he likes to say, it's really a discovery every day. Once it gets into the lab, there's always more that can be done. And as technology moves forward, there's other questions that we didn't even think were possible to ask that we'll be able to ask with material like this.
Well, fascinating stuff. Sadly, our time's up. It's gone so fast. I don't know about you. I feel I've learned such a lot this evening. A huge thanks to Adrian, to Jane, and indeed to all of you for joining us, and to many of you for asking some very good questions. National Museum of Scotland have asked me to thank everyone who made a donation when booking their ticket for tonight's event. And perhaps if you enjoy this free programme of events, you might consider making a donation yourself. Your support will help protect these remarkable collections and help us to share their stories with the world. Thank you very much. Goodbye.